It's a great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of Xavier Hufkens and the directors of the gallery to this press view of the Alice Neel exhibition. It's interesting what you say about the figurative aspect, because Alice Neel, born in 1900, and she began painting in earnest in the 30s, but her passion, her overwhelming passion, was for painting people. And over 50 years, she chronicled people from all walks of life, and at a time of great social and political change. So she was fascinated by people, but the act of painting them maybe held some deeper significance. So what does this tell us about her outlook, and in what way do these paintings go beyond mere portraiture, representation, and touch upon something that is perhaps more universal?
Well, I think she was a woman of great compassion and of political commitment. And so the majority of her paintings are not of well-known people. They're of neighbours, writers, left-wing writers, artists who somehow were part of the subculture, children, her family. And I think what her interest really was more of a psychological interest, and it was her way, I think, both of engaging with people but also engaging with herself. So that the paintings are as much a portrait of her as they are a portrait of the person that she's portraying. And I think the interest in portraiture came from her experience of being in a psychiatric ward in hospital, because as you know, in the 1930s she had a nervous breakdown and she tried to commit suicide, and I think it was being in that sort of environment and talking to the doctors that she began to really understand that actually, if you like, her gift was for analysing people. And she said, if I hadn't been a painter, maybe I would have been a psychotherapist. But I think all these paintings are invested very much with herself. And there's a whole issue of transference and counter-transference, to use psychoanalytical terms, between the painter and the subject. And I think one of the differences between a portrait that Alice Neel paints and portraits that other people have painted, whether in the 20th century or earlier, not all artists, but some artists, is that most portraits, and I'm thinking now of portraits from like the 19th century back, are almost memorials. They are memorials of people who are no longer alive. And even at the time that they were painted, somehow they felt a bit dead. An Alice Neel painting feels to me alive.
Yes.
And as though you're having the conversation with the sitter that she's having. You're continuing it. And I think partly that comes from the fact that they have this sort of look of unfinished. If you look at a number of the well, not this one, but this background here, for example, on Michael Benedict, it has a feel of being unfinished. Even the portrait of her granddaughter, Olivia. And it's almost like you have to complete it yourself. So your engagement is a different kind of engagement.
Yes. And how much do we know about Alice Neel's working practices? Was she painting several portraits concurrently or successively?
No, she painted one, more or less one at a time. And there's film footage of her painting. And certainly by the 70s, and I think this is true of all her life, but she didn't draw on the canvas in charcoal or anything like that. They would all be painted a la prima. But she would start off by painting in a contour. So drawing in paint, not necessarily completing the whole contour of a figure, but maybe a part of it, and then beginning to paint in, and then carrying on. But drawing was fundamental to her practice. And obviously she went through an art school training at the Philadelphia School of Art for Women. And drawing was a very important part of that practice. It was in any art school in the early 20th century.
When Alice Neel was working, photography, and particularly in America, was becoming a very important medium, and both as an art form in its own right and as a record of documenting everyday life. And also, Alice was in a relationship for quite some time with Sam Brody, who was one of the founders of the American Film and Photography League. Do you see any similarities between Neel's work and the contemporary parallel developments in the photographic world at the time?
Definitely. I mean, first of all, she met Sam Brody in 1940, but before then, I think she was already interested in photography. But Sam really, I think, encouraged that more than anything, and he introduced her to all kinds of photography. So she was very interested in Nadar, for example, in his portrait photographs. But Sam also introduced her to August Sander. And as you can look at Alice Neel's paintings, and you can see parallel developments in her work to parallel developments in photography. So she, if you like, moves from a kind of Zander-like approach to painting to a Richard Avedon type approach to painting. So there definitely are parallel developments. Her early works in the 1930s, a lot of them are what some people might describe as social realist, but they're not social realist in the kind of Soviet sense of social realist, but they document things that are going on in New York, whether it's a riot in the street or an investigation of poverty in some kind of office, or fishermen or union figures returning from work, or just the city, the 8th Avenue L. She was part of the WPA program, so she was encouraged to document, if you like, New York. And I think that just as Robert Frank documented the Americans, or Walker Evans would take photographs on the subway of people traveling, he took those surreptitiously by hiding his camera. Alice Neel documented New Yorkers in her own way.
Yes.
And you can see, the changes. You can see the changes of the way people looked throughout her career, the changes in clothing and fashion, the changes of attitudes. She would be painting black people in the 1950s, gay people in the 1950s and 60s. It was still considered, gay people were still considered to be perverse, and it was outlawed, of course. Yeah. But she openly confronted these issues, and she was really socially engaged in a very interesting way. I think it shows you, first of all, how democratic she was. She wasn't just interested in painting stars. She was interested in painting people. And so, the next door immigrant neighbor would be just as interesting to her, and, their, if you like, their lives and their problems, as painting Andy Warhol. Because that's what she was interested in. She was interested in people's lives and how those lives manifested through their appearance, through their gestures, through their clothing, all those kinds of things. So, very often people say, the galleries that show their art say, we have to know something. People always want to know who they are. And I say, well, actually, in a sense, that's not the point. You can construct who they are through looking at the painting,